I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. In this series, we bring in scholars from across the country to present their research and engage in a discussion with the NDSU community. Topics cover innovation, economic opportunity, and ways to increase individual and societal flourishing. I'm super excited today that Ben Klutsey is here. Ben I'm really excited about his topic, but he's been instrumental in the growth of the Challey Institute, helped us out, gone way beyond just what anyone would expect, and he's a great friend, and I'm really excited that he's here today. And so Benjamin Klutsey is the Director of Academic Outreach and the Director of the Program on Pluralism and Civil Exchange at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He facilitates outreach to faculty leaders and university centers to foster collaborations and knowledge sharing about building academic programs. Prior to his work at Mercatus, he worked with the Institute of International Finance, where he analyzed international financial regulations. He received his MA in International Commerce and Policy from George Mason University. And again, I'm really excited that Ben is here today, and thanks for being here, Ben. And let's give a warm round of applause for Benjamin Klutsey. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was a very, very kind introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here. This is my very first time in North Dakota, so it's exciting to be here. I'm going to be talking about Ghana, a little bit about my origins and why I do what I do, why I get so excited about markets and freedom. But it's exciting to see the words up here: human flourishing, human progress, freedom, liberty. These words aren't just words when I hear them. To me, these are ideas. They are ideas that have meaning, and they are ideas that have consequences. The economist John Maynard Keynes said that ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly thought. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. And I connect with this sentiment because I've lived it. I have lived it. When I was a little boy, growing up in Ghana, West Africa, one fateful night, the military came knocking on our door. And they were looking for my father. They found him and they summoned him. They gave him a summons that said, you have to appear at the military barracks the following day. It was a terrifying experience for us. We were scared, didn't know what to do, because the truth is, my parents knew of people who had been summoned like that. They went in and never came back. In fact, no one knew where they were. We couldn't sleep that night. But my father, being the dutiful citizen that he is, woke up in the morning, dressed up, and went over there. When he showed up, they pushed him around, they shoved him, they spat on his face, they harassed him for a very long time for the singular reason of being an entrepreneur. For that reason. See, my father was the first of 6 brothers. He grew up incredibly poor. And he would walk to school barefoot. His mom would put pieces of coconut in his pockets that he could eat for lunch. He was really good at math, so he'd tutor his friends so he could get some lunch. And they struggled to make ends meet. to cut the long story short. Eventually, because he couldn't afford, his parents couldn't afford to take him to school, eventually he opted to do something else. He went about peddling newspapers on the streets. He walked miles and miles and miles each day. Eventually, he found a job with an Italian expat who lived in Ghana at the time. My father ran errands for him and did all kinds of work for him. And one day he called, he said, Kofi, that's my dad's name. He said, Kofi, you seem to be really entrepreneurial. You're always responsible, you're proactive, and it looks like you'd be interested in business. My father said yes, because his singular goal was to be an entrepreneur. He wanted to be a business person. And so this man said, I can teach you the business that I'm involved in. And if you're interested in it, by all means, go ahead and find ways to bring that to fruition. He was in the timber industry at the time. And at the time, the work in timber was very rudimentary. You'd buy round locks and you'd export them. And he taught my father he was interested. But as time went by and he learned a lot, he decided to do something, go a little bit beyond that. So he went to the bank and borrowed his first amount of capital from the bank. And he started building his business, brick by brick, bit by bit. And over time, he built a factory, employed hundreds of people. He had sawmills, he had tractors, he had all kinds of things. And he was really proud of that because it gave him an opportunity to help others also make ends meet. But that night when the military showed up, that dream nearly vanished. It nearly vanished. The country had been ruled by the military for years. And the ideas around, remember, ideas have consequences. The ideas around were about the state controlling all entrepreneurs, all business affairs. In essence, it was socialism, it was authoritarianism. And that was difficult. To illustrate why those were the ideas that came to be, we have to go back in history. And I want to tell you a couple of stories about people who were involved in our history and the transition from the colonial era and to the post-colonial era, and into a period where we began to make some changes and we began to see the economy bounce back. So let's go a little bit further back into history, and I'll give you an abridged version of this. The first people who came to Ghana, the first Europeans who visited Ghana were the Portuguese. They arrived in 1471. And I'm told that years and years and years ago, you would walk along the shores of Ghana, which is located right along the Atlantic Ocean, that right along when you were walking, you would see particles of gold. Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast because you could find so much gold on the land. So the Portuguese came and the effort was to trade, was to do business. They started to do business. Over time, the Danes showed up, the Dutch showed up, the Germans showed up, and eventually in the 1800s, the British showed up as well. And they were British merchants. They also came for business, to work, and to trade. But something began to shift. Eventually, the British government got involved to control the business. They negotiated deals with the Dutch, with the Danes, with the Swedes, with the Germans, so they could control most of that territory. And in 1821, the British government actually took over the entire land. They began by signing trading agreements with the chiefs and with the people. That became a stepping stone for colonization. Now, it wasn't that easy because there were battles that were fought all the way from 1826 up until the 1900s, early 1900s. As they would go further inland, they would meet the Ashanti Kingdom. The Ashanti Kingdom was a very powerful kingdom, and they knew how to fight. So they fought wars, multiple wars. But eventually, the British won. So there was always this skepticism of people coming in with ideas for trading and eventually taking over the land. It is clear to see how that sows the seeds of skepticism around trade, openness to markets, and that drives a lot of sentiment around why we should move towards something like socialism, because when the state controls everything, that we will not have outsiders coming to take over. That was the sentiment. Fast forward many decades, and I want to tell you of a man by the name Kwame Nkrumah. Now, if you've studied any history about the liberation movement in Africa, his name comes up a lot. He was a school teacher, and in his 20s and 30s, he decided to travel to the United States. He actually studied at Lincoln University. He studied philosophy. And at the time, he studied a lot about socialism and Marxism. And he was very motivated by those ideas. After studying in the United States, he traveled to the United Kingdom to continue his studies there. There, he got involved in the Pan-African movement. He was very energized by it. But he was also very good at organizing events, organizing people, a very charismatic individual, very passionate speaker about liberation and independence in Africa. And during that time, this was in the mid-1940s, there was a very strong liberation movement taking place in Ghana. A party had been formed called the United Gold Coast Convention. They had started negotiating with the British for independence. They had heard about this man by the name Kwame Nkrumah, and they said, we ought to bring him home because he will help us with this fight. Keep in mind, Kwame Nkrumah was studying socialism and Marxism. He believed in state control. So Nkrumah came to Ghana to help with the independence effort. But when he came, he said, no, things are moving too slow for me. We need independence now. There were some things that catalyzed the independence movement and the drive towards independence in Ghana. And this is one of the things that did that. Right after World War II, there were ex-servicemen in Ghana who fought for the British Empire. And they fought in Burma primarily against the Japanese. And when they came home, they were promised that they would be paid for their efforts. They did not get paid. So during a time when they had these peaceful protests and they had these marches for independence, they had learned a lot about the Indian independence movement at the time. And so they were motivated and inspired by Gandhi's efforts in India. And so they were taking that course as well. But the ex-servicemen were upset. They said, we need to be paid for our efforts. We fought in the war. We fought for you. Pay us. So they organized a march to the governor's castle, the British governor that ruled Ghana at the time. Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast at the time. They marched there and they had a petition of grievances that they wanted to offer. The British police stood in front of them and they said, you cannot move. They said, no, we want to give this petition. They said, no, you cannot move. Don't take a step further. They did. And the British opened fire, killing 2 ex-servicemen, wounding 3. All hell broke loose. It was rioting all across the country. The news spread. This went on for days. 29 people died, 237 casualties. It was a difficult time, but it was a struggle. And Kwame Nkrumah became the face of all of this effort. In fact, he was even thrown in jail by the British for a while. All these things, to cut the long story short, catalyzed the move towards the independence of the Gold Coast. So Kwame Nkrumah became president eventually, because after he came out of jail, they gave him the chance to form a party. He formed his own party, the Convention People's Party. He ran for elections. And in 1957, Nkrumah became president. Nkrumah said, capitalism is too complicated a system for a newly independent nation. Hence the need for a socialistic society. And they believed that because, especially in the African community, people were very communal, they believed in sharing resources, that it was a system that could easily be imposed and would align very nicely with the culture. So he decided to do 2 things: consolidate economic power and consolidate political power. One of the first things that Nkrumah did was something called the Preventative Detention Act, which he passed in 1958, which basically said that you could be detained if you were seen to be a threat, and you could be put in jail for about 5 years without trial. And then eventually he said, oh, let's make it 10 years. So what he did was he put a lot of his political opponents in jail. Keep in mind that he came to be part of the UGCC, United Gold Coast Convention, that party that invited him to come and help fight independence. He has his own party now. The UGCC is challenging his ideas. They say, no, no, don't do things this way, do things that way. He said, no, you shouldn't challenge me. This is the path that we ought to take. And he started a trend of putting his political opponents in jail. And by 1961, he had detained an estimated number of 400 to 2,000 of his opponents. Consolidating power politically. And in 1964, he put together a referendum that would turn the country into a one-party state. And of course, that one-party state became the CPP, his party. He won this referendum. I mean, he was very charismatic, but he also had a bit of a messiah complex. There were songs about him that he enjoyed, president for life. He's the savior. Yeah, all kinds of things were said about Kwame Nkrumah. So he moved on to economic power. He created what was known as marketing boards. These were Nkrumah appointed people and groups that would go out there. They would purchase all these commodities from, you know, the farmers, right? Cocoa was the largest export in Ghana at the time. So they would buy things like cocoa at really, really, really low prices. And in the world market, they'll sell them very, very high prices, and they'll give the farmers very, very little. They'll pocket the rest. And the goal was that they were going to use that for industrialization. Obviously, the farmers got upset. They actually got out of the farming business. The economy began to go down. And Nkrumah had this idea of the big push. The big push was creating all kinds of industries and companies by the state. They'd create a mango processing plant that was actually not close to any mango trees. They would create leather processing companies. And these things were done in ways that were inefficient, in ways that cost so much, taking the country further and further poverty. And the view was that only the state could mobilize and coordinate the activities that would generate economic transformation for the benefit of the citizens. Eventually, people really were fed up, and they said, why are we escaped colonialism so that we would be free. Why are we being constrained so much, politically and economically? And so on one of his trips abroad, he was visiting China, actually, and he stopped by Vietnam. When he left the country, the military took over. That was the first coup that took place in Ghana in 1966. And from 1966 to 69, and then throughout the late 60s and early to mid 70s, there were a series of coups, one after another. Because once you set the example, people are upset, they take up arms, they go again. This was a difficult period. But beginning in 1979, something happened. This was a coup, but it was led by a man called Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings. Rawlings was a, low-ranking military officer who was upset by all the control that the higher-ranking military officers had. So he said, what we're going to do is that we need to shake things up. We need to shake things up, let them know that we're upset, we're fed up. There were price controls, there were all kinds of restrictions that were constraining the economy. And he was a really great pilot. He took one of the planes unauthorized, maneuvers all over the place. Lower ranking military officers followed him. The agitation began, and they quickly grabbed him. The senior ranking military officials grabbed him. They said, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to start a coup? Are you trying to challenge us? They grabbed him and put him in jail. At the time, the punishment was death by firing squad. So that was what they were going to do to Jerry John Rawlings. This young, I believe 29-year-old military officer. And they said, well, before we execute him, why don't we put him before a tribunal? And we're going to put the whole thing on the radio so people can hear what we do to people who try to challenge us. So they got Rawlings and a few of his colleagues, and he said, look, I'll take the fall. It was my fault. I did this. But he gave one of the most passionate speeches that the country had ever heard since the days of Nkrumah. When they heard him, they said, this is the guy that we want. to lead the country. They put him back that night, planning to execute him the following morning. And that very night, his friends, other military officers, when they broke him out of jail. They broke Rawlings out of jail. All hell broke loose again. And the country was in chaos. It went on for days. They said to Rawlings, you have to step in to lead the country. The story goes, he says that he didn't want to run the country because he knows how to fly planes and not how to lead a country. But after being persuaded for a number of days, he steps forward. His goal was that he would turn things back to the civilians. So he organized elections about 6 months after he takes over. And it seemed as though we were moving towards democracy. Things changed again because people said we're fed up with this thing. Change is taking too long. The president, Hilal Iman, who was the civilian who was running the country, was trying to go through the macroeconomic changes that sometimes take a while to turn things around. This was in the early 80s. Now, Ghana's per capita GDP, starting from the late 1950s to early 60s, was around $400. In late 1979, early 80s, GDP was actually low further down, below $400 per capita GDP. So we hadn't seen major progress, and we'd continue to see a lot of poverty from all the interventions and all the state controls and so on. But people wanted Rawlings back. So he did. In another coup in 1981, he came back. And this was around the time when my father was grabbed by the military. They doubled down on state controls. They doubled down on state controls. And by 1984, I think the state owned about 234 companies. They had nationalized everything from fisheries to telecom, everything. The economy continued to plunge. After a while, at some point, people reached out to Rawlings and said, we have to change something about what we've been doing, because this seems like the path that we've been going for the longest time, and something has to change. So they reached out to the World Bank, IMF advisors that people thought knew something about what you could do alternatively to systems, to economic systems. They implemented something called the Economic Recovery Program in the mid-80s that involved removing subsidies, removing price controls, devaluing the currency, and privatizing many state enterprises. I mentioned that the state owned enterprises, about over 200 of them. They began to divest most of them. Some became joint partnerships, but the goal was that they would move towards private ownership. Test this out to see what happens if you let entrepreneurs own businesses. Allow individuals to have a go at entrepreneurship. And so they did. Now, in 1986, the Washington Post had an article. In that article, it said, until Ghana came along 3 years ago and bought their program, neither the IMF nor the World Bank could point to an African country that had transformed itself using capitalist free market reforms from a basket case into a showcase. Inflation was lowered from 142% in 1983 to 10% by the end of 1991. Now, inflation was so real. You go to the market one day to purchase a bag of rice for, say, 10 cedis. That's our currency. And the following week, you'd go and it's 20. Prices rise so high, people just couldn't afford to buy. There was so much poverty. I mean, people had to go to Togo and Ivory Coast, the bordering countries, or Burkina Faso up top to obtain goods. But inflation began to drop when they started these reforms. Real GDP growth averaged about 5% a year, which resulted in appreciable increases in per capita GDP. By 1991, I mentioned that we were around $400 per capita GDP. In the 80s, by the 90s, we were around $2,000 per capita GDP. Now, this has certainly not been a smooth ride, and I'm not trying to draw a straight line. Lots of challenges along the way. But the moral of the story is that a little bit of freedom goes a long way. A little bit of freedom goes a long way. And it's not just about economic freedom. When we talk about freedom and human flourishing and human progress, it comes from a concept called liberalism, right? It's an emancipatory philosophy. That is, you have to allow individuals to pursue their happiness. And liberalism has about 4 attributes. Dr. Emily Challey Wright, who was here about a year ago, talked about this in a recent article. We have economic liberalism that Adam Smith wrote about, that people have the desire to truck, barter, and trade, to pursue mutually beneficial exchanges. When you allow them to do that, you see lots and lots of progress, you see lots and lots of innovation. That's economic liberalism. There's political liberalism. That's the Constitution, right? The stuff of the Constitution that allows people to participate in a political system, in a political process. That you have the freedom of speech, the freedom of association, of assembly. That's political liberalism. When these two combine, it's so powerful. But it's not only that. There's cultural liberalism, right? The freedom to pursue your faith, religion, traditions. That's cultural liberalism. And then the one that I value the most, maybe not the most, I value all of them, but the one that's really, really important is epistemic liberalism. Freedom to think the way you want, freedom to challenge orthodoxy, freedom to contest ideas without being shut down. That is epistemic liberalism. When you combine all of these 4 things, you lead to powerful outcomes. This is part of the reason I do what I do at Mercatus. I work at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Our goal is to advance ideas for a free society. And I feel like I can contribute in my own small way, help advance the ideas where people like my father can pursue entrepreneurship, can pursue innovation, can speak freely. I remember that when I was a little boy, my father would say to me, when you walk outside of these 4 walls, don't ever talk about politics. Don't challenge this military government. Otherwise, we'll go back to where we were. Through his ingenuity, he was able to build back almost everything that he lost. And it wasn't easy because they seized about 2/3 of his assets. They would sometimes come in and grab one of his cars, grab the keys. We're taking it. Those were difficult times. And he said, don't challenge them. So that constrains epistemic liberalism, the ability to challenge ideas, to contest ideas and say, we need something different. So I'll end the story by saying that this is important. A little bit of freedom goes a long way. And I know it because I've lived it. Thank you for listening. Happy to take questions, only easy ones. Yes.
So, as you know, a lot of African countries after colonization did the socialist thing.
Yes.
And a lot of them did the autocracy and the coups and all of that.
Yes.
And a lot of them, the IMF came in and put in place the same structural reforms or tried to.
That's right.
But Ghana has left a lot of other countries absolutely in the dust
Mhm.
in terms of economic growth. So what is Ghana? What did Ghana do that allowed it to thrive in a way that other countries had?
That's a great question. The question is, for those online, a lot of countries took similar paths in socialism, authoritarianism, and so on, but haven't thrived the way that Ghana has. I think leadership makes a huge difference. Rawlings was a strange case. He came in as a military dictator, he doubled down on socialism, but he had so much passion for the country that he thought there might be something else. There might be alternatives. And when he was introduced, the story goes that he had an engineering mindset and people were showing all these demand and supply curves and price controls and how these things don't work. And he kind of got it. He said, you know what? I'm willing to try this. That made a huge difference. Now, he was in office for 19 years. But for the first half of that, he was mulling through all these ideas. And he says, I'm going to give up my military uniform. And I'm going to run for elections like any other person would in the country who was vying for leadership. So he ran twice and he won. And in 2000, he said, I'm done. The constitution that we put in place in 1992, because there was a reform and they put in place a new constitution in 1992 that said that you can only run for 2 terms. And he listened. There are alternative theories that there was a lot of pressure from the West saying, some threats involved, some incentives involved. But compared to others, we know of Zimbabwe, we know of a whole host who stayed for 40 years. He said, no, I think I'm done and I will leave. A completely different party came into office and they continued the market liberalization reforms. And when you look at the GDP trend, it goes all the way up from 2000 and continues to go up, right? I mean, until COVID, our growth rate was 6.5%. So we were incredibly fortunate, and sometimes we don't consider the role of leadership as much as we probably should. But it could take one person who decides, I'm going to stop this. I'm going to turn things around. I'm going to open myself up to new ideas, right? Going back to sort of the, having a system of liberalism where people can challenge ideas and push back and so on. But he had a change, and that made a huge impact for the country. Yes, sir.
So I'm Cambodian,
Mhm.
and Cambodia went through a very similar reform like Ghana.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the Asian concept is still a concept of the leader, not also a economic growth.
Mm-hmm.
Just need an economic freedom.
Mhm.
So by China or Singapore,
Mm-hmm.
even Cambodian government right now do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think we really need both of them at the same time? Like, some people even say that when you achieve economic freedom,
Mm-hmm.
then one day it's called liberalism. You're gonna achieve that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tough question. You know, the chicken and egg. Is economic liberalism first or political liberalism? I don't think I have an answer to that, to be honest with you. I think that so long as you allow people a little bit of chance to truck, to barter, to trade, that makes a huge difference in their lives, right? We can figure out the philosophical questions and debate those things, but if we're talking about taking people out of poverty and providing some economic sustainability, you need to begin with from that place where you say property rights are important. We allow people to own property so they can do with that property what they desire, right? We know the famous Adam Smith quote, "It is not by the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we have our dinner, but result of their interest." People will pursue their interest, but through that, you know, people rise up. It's a difficult question, and I don't think I have an answer to that. Which comes first? I think they're both important. Like I said, I hope to have all four, you know, everywhere. But if you can achieve a little bit of that, I think that's good. Questions? I know some of you might, you know, are getting ready for class, so you can't wait to dip out, but oh, sorry. Yes, sir.
More specifically, I guess, are there any interesting details about how the relationship to property rights changed during Rawlins?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of the reforms had to do with property rights. The challenge that we've had is that we have a traditional system of property rights with the chiefs. So they have sort of the deeds and all these things to various lands. And they are passed on from generation to generation. If you want land, you would go to a chief. I mean, it happens today. It happens alongside, you know, a sort of a more modernized system where people go through the courts. And we continue to have struggles. And it's a process that's still going on so that all the lands will be under one system of property rights. You know, the Ministry of Land and Forestry has been on this effort since the 80s. But we have sort of a dual system, basically, is the answer. We have a dual system. They're phasing out the traditional system, you know, so that you have a you know, system of record keeping and all these things that things can be passed on more easily, can be traded more easily. But we have a dual system, and it's challenging to sort of keep up. Yeah. Yes, Clay.
We have a question from the online audience. I think it's pretty similar to what you've already answered, but I'll read it to you. What economic concept do you think can turn the tide of things for other countries in Africa where not much has changed?
What economic concept can turn things around for other African countries where not much has changed? You know, I think it's all that I've talked about. You know, Nkrumah said that capitalism is complicated, right? And people use that term capitalism in many different ways. Sometimes people think of it as you just accumulating capital. I'm thinking of it as sort of the freedom to exchange. And you know, he thought that it was complicated. I think socialism or state control is a lot more complicated. You know, what do we produce? How do we produce it? When do we produce it? Those are questions that is going to be very difficult for a centralized authority to be able to figure out at every given corner of the economy and of society. And it's best to allow, you know, individuals and entrepreneurs to figure these things out. Right? It's much easier to do it that way. I'd say the more economic freedoms, the better. That's the concept. And it's really nice to see when, you know, Ghana's taking leadership in, you know, sort of drone delivery of you know, medicine, you know, and things like that in rural parts of the country. All these innovations that are taking place, and it's because there's a lot more openness, a lot more opportunities to test different ideas and test new technologies and innovations. I think that does make a difference. More economic freedom, that's what I'd say. Yes, John.
Talk about four types of liberalism. So you talk about economic and political and kind of highlighted how they have changed in Ghana. So have you seen a growth in the other types of liberalism in Ghana?
Yeah, have we seen growth in the other types of liberalism? One way that I noticed that things have changed in Ghana is that when I go back home and I turn on the radio, people are insulting the government. Not that it's a great thing, but they feel very free to criticize. You know, when Nkrumah was around, newspapers were censored, right? If you criticized the Nkrumah regime, you'd basically lose your job. Newspapers, you know, it gets rough. You know, they challenge, they push back, but no one throws them in jail, right? So that, yeah, I think it's you know, there have been other parties that have emerged. You know, there are two main parties. There are like 3, 4, 5, maybe much smaller parties that are emerging. Obviously, because of the outsized influence of the two major parties, they're not able to gain as much traction, but it's very robust. We just had an election in 2016. They challenged it in the courts. There was a result, and people accepted it. And we've had this since you know, 1999, and it's worked out really nicely. Yes, sir. Yeah, I mean, I guess the social media play a role in liberation. I you know, obviously back then there wasn't any social media, but now you know, people are on it, and it's exciting to see. Twitter actually set up a large headquarters in Africa, and they made Ghana the hub of that. And so you have all these young tech people who are, you know, getting jobs with Twitter. Yeah, folks are very active on social media. So is the government, trying to market their ideas and popularize their policies. But yeah, folks are very active in social media. All right. Any more questions? Should we end early? No more. Okay. Thank you very much.